Alright, welcome back to my makeshift studio. I'm going to demonstrate some solid building processes today. So what I have here are two different pieces in progress, and basically what I did is I found these at two different stages really. They were both pretty stiff already, almost too stiff to do much else with, and certainly too stiff to wedge or work with on the wheel. This one was actually quite stiff and almost in this same shape, and so you can kind of see the organic qualities that are inherent in this the way I found it, and really trying to retain those qualities in the finished sculpture. And then this one was actually half a block of clay left over that had gotten a little stiff, and what I did is I just took that block and slammed it down on the pavement in the driveway to give it this more boulder-like shape. And so you can see that I've actually got some debris stuck on the side of here, and certainly picked up the texture from the pavement in spots. And I actually, in some areas, didn't slam it down on the pavement to leave the kind of softer natural clay quality. And so a lot of times in my work, and especially when I do these solid kind of carving projects, I try to retain that inherent natural quality of the clay. And so, given it's Earth Day, happy Earth Day everybody, I thought it would be appropriate to finish these pieces and share the process and the work with you. So that said, this is the one that I started in intermediate hand building before school was closed for gatherings. And so you can see that is quite stiff now, right? There's very, very stiff leather hard, not bone dry, but definitely very stiff. And typically I have a piece of foam, an old pillow, even some old towels folded up, something soft that I can lie these things down on. And then I need really minimal tools to do this process. Mostly I use an assortment of loop tools like you use for trimming on the wheel, or even just carving tools, a sharp knife potentially. I've got my little stamp here. This guy, I actually just took a wire through here to separate, make two sections. This one's quite a bit softer than this, but still stiff leather hard. And so you can see that's going to become a jar or a box of some kind. Alright. So generally speaking, what I'm looking for is when I have these solid pieces, I'm looking for the outside surface to be kind of a stiff leather hard, because I want to be able to lay it down without ruining whatever texture I have on it or surface quality. And then typically the inside, because it's the core in the middle, is still softer clay, which makes it a little bit easier to carve that out. Alright, and so this one, I've already mostly carved this out. The only place I haven't gotten into is kind of this upper portion. And so I find the easiest way to get into these deep and narrow recesses, if I want to thin that out some, is actually just use a drill and a drill bit. And I wanted to show you that, but of course my drill battery is not charged, and so I figured I would just go ahead and explain the process, and I didn't figure you needed to see that anyhow. But essentially what I'm going to do is just wrap this back up in plastic, and then I'll come back with the drill bit and just at an angle make sure I'm coming up inside of these kind of protrusions on the top. So I could also get in and try to bore a hole in the middle of it up into there with a loop tool, but that's going to be way more time consuming and more strenuous. And you can see sometimes when I do that, I end up breaking my tools because the clay is stiff and I'm carving on it. Alright, so things to consider. So I'm actually just going to wrap this one up for the time being, and I'll come back and drill that at a later date, and hopefully near future. And then my last note on that is I've got this little sketch here, and if this is like 4 inches across, and I'm drilling up in from the bottom, even a small needle hole coming up to here, if it's directly in the middle, leaves me of course 2 inches or so on either side. So I'm taking my thickest part and turning it from 4 inches to 2 inches, which is a significant difference, right? So, food for thought. And folks that saw the first part of this demonstration also saw a slightly bigger piece that was completely solid. So, one of the myths in ceramics is that you can't make things too thick, right? And really, you can make clay almost as thick as you like. Of course, the more tooth it has in it, the better, and the greater your chance of success or survival is. And the key, of course, is this longer drying time and a slower firing speed. Alright, so on that note, I'm just going to set this one down aside for the time being. And then this guy, see it's a little sticky still. I'm going to lie that down. And then often what I do is, and I'll do this at some point, is I'll just put a swatch of underglaze or something on there. Not only for color and surface enhancement, but just to kind of mark where that lid fits onto the bottom portion, right? And then, generally speaking, the way I start the boxes is I'm just gonna roughly mark where I'm gonna trim out. This is actually feels quite soft on the inside yet, which is nice. So I can mark that, go ahead and mark this one if I want, or I can do it when I'm closer to ready to carving on it. And it might be, if this is really soft, sometimes what I'll do is carve some of it out and then walk away from it for a while and let it stiffen up some more. Because clearly as I carve it, it gets thinner, and then that helps in aid in the drying process. So I usually, it might be a little bigger than I need for this scale of a piece, but I usually start with a bigger tool, just carve out. Alright, so I've got this mostly carved out, and you can see in that sped up portion of the video that I was periodically feeling and pinching all around this just to get a sense of the thickness. Really the idea is I'm shooting for a consistent thickness, and so whether that's an eighth of an inch or an inch or what have you, you just want it to be relatively close to the same thickness throughout, right? So most of you probably already know this, but the reason I'm doing that is thinner parts are going to want to dry faster, and if you have really thin parts next to thick parts, that could lead to cracking issues because of that reason. So with this, there's two more things I kind of want to do, and the first is right now the thickest part is right here, this rim or flange that actually sits down on the bottom portion, and so I'm going to take some of that excess off. Now, generally speaking, I like to leave that a little bit thicker, just so that there's a fair amount of surface area that those two rest on one another. And then just like making cups or bowls or any other functional pot, whether it's on the wheel or otherwise, I don't want to have sharp corners, right? If this edge is at a crisp 90 degrees, it's a lot more prone to chipping or cracking when I'm taking the lid on and off of the jar once it's fired. If this is slightly rounded or beveled, it's a lot more durable. So thin it, and then I go ahead and usually run like an X-Acto knife or something, or any other sharp knife on that edge. Just bevel it a little bit. So I've got my knife here. I'm going to take and get rid of, you can see there's a little bit of a flange here that pushed up from my carving, so I'm going to knock that down. And then I'm just going to come all the way around, bevel this corner. And then I've got a lot of lines inside of this thing. I don't know if you can see that or not. You can see like where the edge of the tool was, it's leaving these lines or edges. So I might come the smaller loop tool, try to knock some of those down, particularly where there's really thin edges that'll be fragile and or sharp once it's fired. So I'm kind of going to clean some of those up quickly. And then the last thing that I want to do with this, and this really works best if there is a little bit of moisture still in here, is I want to come and of course compress the walls and the floor, right? I want to compact clay molecules to make this thing stronger. And certainly when I formed it and kind of slammed it on the floor, that helped with that to some degree. But when I'm finding these things as big chunks of clay or blocks of clay that came straight out of a clay bag, I know that there's potentially air pockets in there. Molecules are not as compact or compressed as they could be, and so more inclined to want to crack if I don't do a good job of compressing, right? So I might even just take my finger, kind of smooth this edge out, and then some of the cleanup is really gonna work best once this is stiffer. So I generally will come back to things and just before bone dry and even at bone dry sometimes, if I'm going to use like a Scotch-Brite scouring pad to smooth anything. That of course works best when a piece is bone dry. And one of the hard things about making videos, of course, is having the clay at the appropriate stage of wet or dry. Kind of reminds me of doing demos in the studio. And then, so I'm just going to come and with my finger, I'm supporting on the outside with my one hand. And not only am I smoothing this a little bit, but like I said earlier, compressing the clay itself to make it stronger. Of course, if you accidentally carve too far and have a thin spot, you want to be very conscious and careful as you compress that part, maybe even score and slip a little more clay back in there to reinforce it. Except for I did ding up the rim a little bit there, bumping it with my knuckle as I smoothed and compressed the inside. So get that little ding back out. Might even just drag the flat edge of this blade on here to clean up that corner a little bit. Alright, and then I would just take and set that part aside. Leave it on here actually. And then repeat the process. Alright, so once I've got both parts of this hollowed out, compressed, and cleaned up as much as I can at this stage, I'm going to go ahead and set these guys back together. Let them do their little hugging mechanism here. Set that down. And the last thing I want to address now is this seam right here. So one of the things that I was doing in the expedited part of the demo that I failed to mention earlier is that when I'm compressing or carving on the inside, I have always got support on the outside, right? Because, and especially for a functional piece like this where it's a lid and it has to fit back on there, I want to be really conscious not to distort the shape. And if the clay is stiff to a point where I don't have to worry about distorting the shape, I could still start a stress crack if I'm applying pressure, carving into it or compressing into it, and I don't have support on the outside. So a lot of times what I do is I just come around like I am now, use a finger, kind of push those edges together, make sure they're lined up to the best of my ability. And then, last but not least, I'm going to take my little stamp and put my mark of approval on here, and I'm actually going to stick that right on that seam. So that'll be my key right there to know how this lid comes on and off, or at least one of. And then you can also grab a little splotch of underglaze. I'll just do a band of that on here. I think one of my favorite things about underglaze is that it's so versatile as to when you can apply it. So most of you probably know already that can go on to leather hard, it can go on bone dry, it can go on bisqueware, you can even apply underglaze over a fired on glaze a lot of times. Although that could potentially result in a surface texture you were not expecting if the glaze underneath is really fluid. And then I'm actually just with a relatively dry brush, in other words minimal amounts of underglaze, and at a horizontal angle trying to hit the high spots here, right? So I'm adding some color, building my surface already during the building process, but also the idea is to hit the high spots and miss the low spots and accentuate that texture I picked up from slamming this guy on the concrete. I think one of the things I like about these organic shapes, especially in this time of uncertainty, is, and the material itself is really is a way to help me keep grounded, much like a yoga practice or running regimen. So in any case, there you have it. I'll just let this set up for a while, stiffen out. I may look at it again when it's substantially stiffer, say it's, I don't know, middle of the afternoon now, so tomorrow morning I may check on this, and I'll let it breathe for 3 or 4 hours, cover it with plastic, check it in the morning, maybe do a little bit of cleanup, and then let it just dry out to bone dry and potentially readdress. But I think it should have pretty minimal cleanup at this point. So that's my solid building demonstration. I hope you have a happy Earth Day, and I will see you soon.